The scent of pine and seasoned hickory was the smell of safety to Liam. He stood back, wiping a layer of fine sweat from his brow with the back of a canvas work glove, and admired his work. The stack was perfect, a fortress of fuel against the inevitable brutal siege of the Sierra winter. It was 6 feet high, 30 feet long, neatly covered by a heavy tarp secured with bungee cords, and stood exactly 42 feet from the perimeter of his small, sturdy cabin, right where the old property line met the start of the pine forest. He'd spent 4 weekends in September hauling, splitting, and stacking that wood. Every log represented a night he wouldn't freeze, a meal he could cook when the power lines snapped, a buffer between him and the wilderness that was both beautiful and terrifyingly indifferent. In a community like Blackwood Peaks, where the houses were mostly oversized, modern shells built for weekend tourists and managed by an omnipresent HOA, Liam's small, self-sufficient cabin felt like an anachronism. It also made him a target. The silver Mercedes SUV slid silently to a stop on the crushed granite of his driveway, its polished surface reflecting the weak afternoon sun. Out stepped Ilara Vance, the president of the Blackwood Peaks Homeowners Association, dressed in a tailored quilted vest, pristine white pants, and boots that cost more than Liam's entire winter heating budget. She didn't look like someone who had ever carried anything heavier than a Chanel handbag. "Mr. Thorne," Ilara announced, her voice pitched with a saccharine, sweet formality that was somehow more condescending than outright anger. She held a clipboard and squinted at the massive woodpile. "I'm afraid we have a problem." Liam pushed his sunglasses up and rested a heavy axe handle on the ground. "Morning, Ilara. That woodpile is legally on my deeded land. I checked the survey markers twice." "Oh, I'm sure it is legally on your land, Liam," she corrected, tapping the clipboard with a manicured fingernail. "The concern, however, is not the deed. It's the aesthetic. And the height." Liam felt the slow, heavy burn of anger begin low in his chest. He knew this game. He'd played it for 5 years with the HOA since he bought the property, a man who valued function over form, constantly battling a woman who valued control over common sense. It's 6 feet high. Ilara, that's standard cord stacking procedure to maximize drying time and stability. It's properly seasoned for the deep freeze coming in a few weeks. What specific HOA bylaw is 6 feet too high? Ilara smiled, a thin, brittle gesture that never reached her eyes. Bylaw 7.3c, subsection K4. Exterior storage of combustible materials must not exceed 4 feet in height, nor extend more than 10 feet in length, and must be concealed from the main thoroughfare by an approved, opaque architectural barrier. Liam stared at the 30-foot-long, 6-foot-high wall of his survival. Concealed? It's 30 feet from the road. And it's firewood! What am I supposed to do, build a mahogany gazebo around it? "The bylaws," Ilara said, her voice dropping into the familiar, non-negotiable drone of the perpetually self-righteous, "are clear. They were voted on by the board, which, as you know, I head, to maintain the integrity and valuation of our community. Your stack is visible from the road, it's aesthetically jarring, and frankly, it constitutes a fire hazard at that height. You have been issued a formal notice of violation, Notice 44B, delivered via certified mail this morning." "Notice 44B," Liam repeated, the words tasting like metal. "That's the notice that arrives the day after I finish stacking. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. Timeliness is important, Liam. You have precisely 48 hours to correct the violation. If the material is not reduced to compliance and adequately screened by 5 p.m. on Monday, the association will employ a service to correct the violation, and the costs, including a fine of $700, will be assessed to your quarterly dues." She tucked the clipboard under her arm. "Have a wonderful weekend." She didn't wait for a reply, returning to her climate-controlled vehicle. As she drove away, Liam watched the silver Mercedes disappear down the winding road, leaving a deep, toxic silence in its wake. Liam didn't touch the wood for the rest of the day. He couldn't. His hands were shaking with suppressed rage. That wood wasn't just heat. It was the result of a financial sacrifice. He had poured almost every spare cent he had into buying the raw logs from a distant, reputable lumber yard and renting a commercial splitter, ensuring they were the dense, slow-burning hardwoods he needed. The alternative, Relying solely on his aging, inefficient propane furnace was not an option. A typical mountain winter could chew through his propane tank in 2 months. He spent the next day trying to fight the notice. He called the HOA management company, only to be redirected to Ilara's private number, which, predictably, went straight to voicemail. He emailed the HOA board members, attaching satellite images proving the stack was on his land and citing historical precedents of larger wood piles. The replies trickled in. They were curt, uniform, and devastating. "We rely on the president's discretion for aesthetic matters." The notice stands. Ilara had stacked the deck. The board were her puppets. That night, Liam pulled up the weather forecast. The national models were screaming alarm. A historic pressure anomaly was tracking south, a polar vortex that was going to slam into the Sierras not in 2 weeks but in 3 days. The expected low was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill making it feel like minus 40. It was a killer storm, the kind you survived by planning, not by bureaucracy. He knew he couldn't fight Ilara and restack the wood in time before the blizzard hit. He had to concede. Monday morning, he drove to the nearest town, 40 miles down the mountain, to buy lumber to build a compliant, screened storage shed, a pathetic 4-foot-high, 10-foot-long box that would hold maybe a tenth of his winter supply. He returned around 3 p.m., defeated, ready to begin the backbreaking, heartbreaking work of breaking down his survival wall. But the wall was gone. The site where the towering stack of pine, hickory, and oak had stood was now a perfectly raked patch of gravel. There wasn't a single chip of bark or stray piece of sawdust remaining. Liam stood there, the expensive, freshly cut lumber for the required shed dropping from his numb fingers. Ilara hadn't waited for the 5 p.m. deadline. She had acted at her discretion, citing a clear and present danger to property values, in an addendum she had likely scribbled herself an hour after delivering the original notice. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, who had witnessed the entire callous operation. Henderson. 3 guys, flatbed truck. Took every stick. Ilara Vance was directing traffic. Said they're storing it at the HOA maintenance yard until compliance is met. Liam stared at the empty space. That wood was his. He had receipts for the timber and the splitter rental. It was his property. It was his lifeline. He got into his truck and drove, fast, towards the HOA maintenance yard on the far side of the community. The yard was locked, but over the chain-link fence beyond the dumpsters and the rusting snow removal equipment he saw it, his stack. Messily thrown onto a concrete slab, uncovered, exposed to the elements, and clearly marked with a laminated sign that read, "Confiscated Materials. HOA Property." Liam's fury wasn't a quick burst of heat. It was a cold, calculated clarity. He wasn't just facing an HOA fine. He was facing a blizzard with a nearly empty propane tank and no reliable way to heat his home. Ilara had just signed his death warrant, all over an aesthetic violation. He drove back to his cabin. He didn't waste time trying to break into the yard or arguing with a locked gate. He had 48 hours until the snow started falling, and his mind was now solely focused on triage. He checked his propane, 20% remaining. Not enough. He checked the town's wood suppliers, all sold out, citing the emergency forecast. He called his old friend, a former Army Ranger who lived 200 miles away, who promised to send a half-cord via emergency shipping, but warned it wouldn't arrive until Wednesday. A full day after the blizzard hit, Liam stood in the empty space where his wood had been. He looked up at the darkening, bruised purple sky, the specific unsettling color that preceded a truly massive storm. He heard the roar of an expensive, top-of-the-line generator kick on down the road. It was Ilara's. She was preparing for the power outages. She had her backup plan, relying on the luxury of electricity and modern heating. But electricity was fickle, especially in a blizzard that would snap transmission lines like toothpicks. Liam went inside and opened a closet, pulling out a small steel toolkit. He laid out the contents: a heavy, diamond-tipped glass cutter, a small spool of high-gauge wire, and a pair of surgical gloves. He looked at the window where the first hesitant snowflakes of the vanguard had begun to drift past. The temperature was dropping. Meanwhile, 2 miles away at Ilara Vance's meticulously organized 3-story show home, Ilara was in her sunroom sipping a single malt scotch, reviewing her itinerary for the next week's tropical cruise, already mentally listing the 5 things she would complain about to the resort manager. The woodpile situation was handled. Satisfied. She'd shown that man, Liam Thorne, that the rules applied to everyone, especially the outliers. Integrity and valuation. A sudden, sharp poppy echoed from the wall outlet near her fireplace. The automated gas fireplace, decorative mostly, but expensive, flickered and died. Ilara frowned, reaching for the remote. Nothing. She checked the Liam didn't need a thermometer to tell him the temperature was plummeting. The air inside his small cabin already felt thin and brittle, stinging the back of his throat. He stripped off his denim jacket, revealing a thin, synthetic base layer, the kind of clothing that held heat close, designed for movement in the mountains. He looked at the meager stream of flame sputtering in the pilot light of his propane furnace. The metallic thunk it made when it cycled on sounded desperate, asthmatic, consuming precious fuel. He didn't waste time looking at the confiscated lumber for the compliance shed. That was now just expensive trash. He returned to the toolkit he had laid out. The glass cutter wasn't for Ilara's mansion. It was for his own home. Liam moved quickly, his actions honed by years of anticipation. He didn't trust modern systems. That was his core difference from the residents of Blackwood Peaks. The power grid had failed, and his propane was a ticking clock. He used the diamond-tipped wheel to score a perfect, neat square into the single-pane window of his small pantry, a room located centrally in the cabin. He sealed the door crack with old duct tape and pulled heavy blankets over the 2 remaining interior doorways leading to the living room and bedroom, creating a thermal choke point. He then took the square of glass out, passed the high-gauge wire through the opening, and ran it to a small, deep-cycle battery he kept charged in his workshop. Attached to the wire inside the pantry was a jury-rigged heating element, a coil of nickel-chromium wire carefully wrapped around a ceramic block, shielded by a metal mesh and resting on stone tiles. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't safe for long-term use, but it was a heat source entirely independent of the grid and his gas line. He used a separate wire to power a small, quiet computer fan, positioning it to circulate the heat within the 12-foot square space. "Pantry is the war room," he muttered, turning the fan on. The low hum and the faint, coppery scent of heating metal were instantly comforting. He sealed the glass back into the frame with thick, weatherproof sealing tape. The tiny room was now a thermal bubble. He would live in the pantry until the storm passed, saving every cubic foot of propane. He pulled on a heavy, insulated coat, secured the surgical gloves over his base layer gloves, and strapped on a pair of headlamp goggles. It was time for Phase 2. Retrieval. Meanwhile, in Ilara Vance's custom-built sunroom, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. The house was not just cold. It was actively drawing heat from her body. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows were now sheets of frosted glass, and the cold air pouring off them was condensing instantly into pools of water on the marble floor. Ilara had abandoned the sunroom for the main parlor, a space slightly more centralized but still dominated by soaring vaulted ceilings that acted as chimneys for the escaping heat. She was dressed in 4 cashmere sweaters, leggings, and a fur-lined housecoat she usually reserved for Aspen trips. She was curled on a silk sofa, shivering violently. "This is ridiculous," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard the words sounded clipped. She tried her phone again, hoping the surge had somehow reversed itself. Nothing. She found the landline, an antiquated piece of technology she kept mostly for show, and the dial tone was dead. The cable was out, the internet was out. She was entirely alone in a shell of glass and metal. She had called the Blackwood Peaks emergency number an hour ago, but the automated message simply repeated, "Due to the Level 4 extreme weather event and community-wide power failure, please shelter in place. All non-life-threatening service calls are suspended." Life-threatening. Was this life-threatening? Ilara dismissed the thought. She was Ilara Vance. She didn't have life-threatening emergencies. She forced herself up and trudged through the cavernous, darkened kitchen to the attached two-car garage. The generator. It was her salvation. It was a $15,000 unit, professionally installed, capable of running the entire house, including the pool heater. It shouldn't have failed. She opened the generator housing. It was a mess. The wires that led to the transfer switch were fused, burnt black at the connection point. The surge had been massive, a lightning strike or a transformer blowout powerful enough to bypass the surge protection and melt the expensive custom wiring. The generator itself was fine, but the system connecting it to the house was ruined. "Stupid," she muttered, kicking the metal casing, instantly regretting the pain in her foot. Stupid cheap electricity. She had propane, of course. 2 massive buried tanks for her decorative fireplaces and her hot water. But the fireplaces were automated. They required a pilot light and a functioning electronic igniter. The igniter required electricity. She sank onto a tool chest, clutching her knees to her chest, trying to remember what to do in a blackout. Candles? Yes. She found a decorative jar of scented candles and lit 3, placing them on the kitchen island. They provided a weak, flickering light, but no noticeable warmth in the vast space. She remembered the wood. Her firewood. The wood Liam Thorne had stacked. A sickening realization washed over her. She could have simply moved a portion of the stack to the screened area, leaving enough for her to survive. But her need for control, her need to show Liam he couldn't defy her, had driven her to remove every single log. Now, those logs, her only potential source of high BTU heat, were locked away 2 miles away in a cinder block shed, chilling rapidly in the open air. Just like her. She pulled out her keys, the heavy, official HOA key ring clanking against the marble. She still had the key to the maintenance yard. If she could just get to the yard, she could grab a few logs, drive them back, and build a small, contained fire in her ornamental, unpowered gas fireplace. It was dangerous, but less dangerous than freezing. She pulled on a pair of sleek, leather-driving gloves and her thickest wool coat, stepping outside the insulated garage door. The blizzard hit her like a physical object. The wind howled, a high-pitched, mocking scream, and the snow was blinding, driving sideways. She could barely see her silver SUV only 10 feet away. The temperature was already deep below 0. Her breath crystallized instantly, making her lungs ache. She struggled to the car, fumbling the key into the door lock. It turned with a frozen, sickening resistance. She climbed in, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine cranked, C, and then stopped. The cold had bled the battery dry. Modern complex cars were highly susceptible to extreme cold, especially if they weren't kept in a heated garage. Her garage, lacking electricity, was now just a cold box. Alara laid her head on the steering wheel. Her meticulously planned, luxurious life was unraveling because of a $60 car battery and a single idiotic, power-hungry mistake she had made hours ago. Liam was already on the move. He didn't take his truck. In this kind of snow, the visibility was a liability, and a running engine was too loud. He used his old mountain bike, fitted with custom, studded tires for ice and snow, and wore a black backpack containing a small, folding sled. He navigated by memory and the subtle relief of the terrain, moving along the tree line to stay out of sight of the main road. The snow was already deep, making the pedaling a brutal, silent workout. He wasn't stealing. He was performing a recovery of stolen property. The distinction mattered to his conscience. When he reached the HOA maintenance yard, the snow had coated everything in a thick, insulating layer. The compound was silent and dark. He bypassed the main gate. The lock was heavy-duty, but the chain-link fence separating the yard from the forest was old. He reached into his pack and pulled out a simple pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. The glass cutter was a red herring, an emergency tool for his own home. He snapped the chain link near the base of a post, creating a small, low opening just large enough to roll the sled through. Inside, the light from his headlamp cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the sorry state of his firewood. It was, as he suspected, a disaster. The men Alara had hired had simply dumped the logs onto the concrete slab. The concrete was freezing, drawing moisture up into the wood, and the lack of a covering meant the pristine, seasoned logs were now rapidly accumulating a layer of ice and wet snow. In 2 days, the center of the pile would be unusable. Liam ignored the bulk of the pile. He went straight for the logs on the top, still relatively dry. He selected the hardest, densest cuts, hickory and oak, and carefully stacked them onto his sled. He packed just enough for 4 days, maybe 2 dozen heavy logs. He wasn't taking what he wanted. He was taking what he needed to survive the worst of the storm, leaving the rest to freeze into a useless, waterlogged monument to Ilara's folly. As he worked, his headlamp briefly illuminated a smaller covered shed near the front of the yard. It was marked HOA Equipment Emergency Supplies. Liam paused. His anger had cooled into calculated survival, but now a flicker of pure retribution sparked. He walked over to the shed. The door was secured with a standard residential padlock, far less robust than the main gate. He knelt, and instead of cutting the lock, he used a specialized tension wrench and pick. He was highly skilled in many forms of self-sufficiency. Click. The lock popped open. Inside, the shed was neatly organized. Propane tanks, cases of emergency MREs, bags of calcium chloride road salt, and then he saw it. A brand new boxed heavy-duty marine battery charger, the exact kind needed to restart a dead car battery in extreme. The dawn did not break. It merely refused to be swallowed entirely by the snow. Inside Ilara Vance's parlor, the ambient temperature was reading 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the freezing point of water. Every exhale created a fog that lingered in the frigid air. The massive, open-plan house was now a monument to thermal inefficiency, a beautiful glass and marble tomb that actively sapped the heat from anything inside it. Ilara woke to the pain. It was a deep, bone-aching ache that was beyond shivering. Her hands were numb, clumsy claws wrapped around a decorative silk pillow. Her breathing was shallow, punctuated by a wet, rattling cough that echoed in the cold silence. She tried to move her feet, but the expensive, thin cashmere socks were damp from the melted frost that had pooled on the floor overnight. Panic, raw and unmanaged, began to override her usual meticulous control. This wasn't an inconvenience. It was a siege. She forced herself to the bathroom mirror, using a scarf to wipe away the heavy condensation. The reflection was horrifying. A pale, drawn face, lips faintly blue, with the desperate, wide eyes of a hunted animal. Her vanity, the thing she had prioritized above all else, including Liam's survival, was useless against the cold. The priority shifted from comfort to survival. Food and fire. She needed to get to the maintenance yard. It was 2 miles away, an easy drive in the summer, but an impossible distance in this white hell. Her car was useless. She had no other choice. If she didn't get high BTU wood and find a way to make fire, she knew with cold certainty that she wouldn't survive the second night. The blizzard was supposed to last 3 days. She dressed, pulling on every layer she possessed: ski thermal leggings, a bulky parka she hadn't worn in 5 years, thick ski gloves, and a pair of tall, fashion-forward leather boots with inadequate tread. She grabbed the heavy HOA keyring. The key to the maintenance shed felt like an anchor, and jammed a half-empty bottle of expensive bottled water and a stale protein bar into her pocket. She avoided looking at the dead generator in the garage, a $15,000 piece of equipment that had failed her because of a $5 piece of copper wiring. Stepping out the back door was like plunging into an ice bath. The wind was relentless, shoving her back, whipping snow into her eyes and mouth. The first 100 yards were the worst. The deep, unconsolidated snow hid patches of ice, and her inadequate boots slipped and slid. She fell twice, the hard impact knocking the air from her lungs. The second fall scraped her gloved hand raw against the granite pathway, but she barely felt the pain, only the crushing cold. She abandoned the pathway and tried to stick close to the property fences, using them as windbreaks and guides, but the snowdrifts were chest-high in places. Her breathing became ragged and the cough worsened, a constant debilitating presence in her chest. Every step required a conscious, agonizing decision. Her lungs burned with the effort, and her cashmere layers, already damp with sweat, were now beginning to freeze, making her coat heavy and rigid. The 2-mile walk, which should have taken 40 minutes, stretched into 2.5 hours of pure existential struggle. Her sense of time warped, reduced to a series of gasps and forward lurches. Liam was in his thermal bubble, the pantry. He was using his recovered logs sparingly, fueling the small, enclosed wood-burning stove he had installed years ago as a pure backup system, another aesthetic violation he had somehow managed to sneak past the HOA. The small room was roasting, the air dry and pine-scented. He was monitoring the temperature outside via a weather station clipped to the porch railing and checking the propane pressure gauge every 20 minutes. He was safe. He had survived the first night, a night that had clearly decimated the community's power infrastructure. He had a pair of powerful, high-magnification binoculars set up near the small glass square he had installed. He wasn't looking for Alara. He was scanning the utility lines and neighboring roofs. He was looking for signs of life, signs of major trouble. Around mid-morning he saw it, a tiny dark shape crawling against the blinding white backdrop near the main road. It moved awkwardly, sinking with every step, pausing often. Liam raised the binoculars, his gaze focusing on the distant figure. The fur-lined hood, the sleek parka, the awkward, untrained stagger. It was Alara. She was alone, fighting a headwind strong enough to knock a grown man down. She was heading in only one direction, the maintenance yard. A cold, heavy knot twisted in Liam's gut. He knew the yard was 2 miles out. He knew she wouldn't make it back, even if she secured the wood. She was already exhibiting signs of advanced exhaustion and exposure. She was going to freeze to death on the journey, driven by the desperation of her own making. He watched for 10 minutes as she fought the storm, occasionally dropping to her hands and knees before struggling back upright. He felt no pity, only a grim, professional assessment of the consequences of her failure to prepare. But then a subtle shift occurred. Her silhouette didn't get up after the third fall. It remained a dark, unmoving blot in the snow. Liam took a deep breath, the warm, dry air of the pantry scalding his lungs. He was safe. He could wait it out. He could let the mountain dispense its own form of justice. He stood up, looking at the door to the pantry, the thermal blanket protecting him. Alara reached the chain-link fence of the HOA maintenance yard, not walking, but crawling, dragging her body forward with what felt like her last reserves of strength. The keyring was frozen to her glove. She fumbled with the main gate lock, her fingers too stiff to turn the key. She fell, cheek first, onto the freezing snow, tasting the ice. Through her blurred vision, she saw the gap at the bottom of the fence, the one Liam had left twisted but concealed. She pushed her way through the narrow opening, tearing her parka on the jagged wire. Inside, the maintenance yard was an absolute disaster. Her firewood, Liam's firewood, was now a mound of snow-covered, frozen-together logs, useless for immediate combustion. She staggered towards the small emergency shed, driven by the memory of the emergency supplies. The lock, she noted with a moment of numb confusion, was missing. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the shelves were disorganized. The MREs were gone. The road salt was gone. And the boxed, heavy-duty marine battery charger was gone. A raw, primal scream tore from her chest, instantly silenced by the wind. Liam. He hadn't just taken his wood. He had systematically stripped the HOA emergency resources that were meant to keep the community alive. He had foreseen her desperation and had ensured that the easy path back to warmth was completely closed off. She stumbled to the woodpile, choosing a few logs from the center that were less covered in ice. They were heavy dead weights. She dragged them back to the fence opening and forced herself out. She had to get back to the house somehow, and try to start a fire in the non-functional fireplace using the raw logs and whatever paper she could find. She secured 3 logs to her chest using the cord from her ski goggles. She took 5 steps away from the fence and collapsed again. This time she knew she couldn't get up. Her legs were lead, and the rattling in her chest was turning into something worse, a shallow, agonizing burning. Hypothermia was closing in. She lay face down in the snow, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. Her last conscious thought was a bitter, desperate curse aimed at Liam Thorne, the outcast who had dared to defy her rules. Then, through the sound of the wind, a new noise broke through, the sound of a two-stroke engine, high-pitched and tinny. A snowmobile! Ilara forced her head up, turning towards the sound. Through the blinding snow, she saw it, a dark, bulky silhouette moving fast, cutting a straight line through the drifts, heading directly for the maintenance yard. It wasn't Liam's small utility bike. This was a serious machine, and it wasn't heading for her. The snowmobile stopped near the emergency shed. A tall, bundled figure in black work gear jumped off, went straight to the firewood pile, and began loading logs onto a tow sled. The figure was moving efficiently, not desperately. It was another resident, likely alerted by the open shed door Liam had left behind, now scavenging for survival. Ilara tried to yell, tried to wave, tried to crawl, but her voice was a gasp and her limbs refused to respond. She was watching another person, another neighbor, take the last remaining fuel, driven by the same fear that had frozen her own body. The karma of the HOA, the self-serving bureaucracy she had enforced, had finally devoured the safety net for everyone, including herself. As the second neighbor sped away, having secured his own survival, Ilara was left in the emptiness. She realized the snowmobile tracks led past her position, back towards the main cluster of homes. She had one choice left. The distance to her cold mansion was insurmountable. The distance to Liam's cabin, the source of the single, tiny warm light she had seen the night before, the only light she could faintly still see flickering in the far distance, was closer. With a final, shattering exertion, she rolled over, pushing her frozen body into a crawl, turning her back on her own ruined luxury home, and heading into the white toward the man she had tried to ruin. The snow was already filling in the tire tracks of the second scavenger. She was crawling on pure, desperate instinct. The small sealed pantry was silent save for the soft, rhythmic hiss-click of the nickel-chromium element and the low, comforting crackle of seasoned oak in the small stove. Liam sat cross-legged on a pile of sleeping bags, organizing his meager stock of dried goods. A man entirely self-contained. Outside, the blizzard continued its brutal, unbroken roar. He had calculated his resources. He could easily survive 5 days in this thermal bubble. Ilara Vance was a problem solved, relegated to the category of natural selection as the mountain taught its lessons. Then, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, not a natural sound, but a scrape. A dry, weak, frantic scratching against the exterior paneling of the cabin. Liam froze, his eyes instantly tracking to the heavy-duty deadbolt on the pantry door, then to the binoculars. He moved silently, peeling back the thick thermal blanket covering the inner doorway to the main cabin. The temperature difference was instant and shocking. The main cabin was now an icebox, the air thick with the metallic smell of deep cold. He listened. The scraping sound came again, followed by a heavy, desperate thump against the main door, too weak to be an attempted entry, too intentional to be a falling branch. Liam walked to the front door, which was reinforced and insulated. He didn't turn on the interior lights. He didn't want to alert anyone else to his sanctuary. He pressed his face close to the tiny, scratched-up peephole. The image was distorted by the swirling snow and the sheer amount of ice on the outer lens. But he saw a shape, a large, dark lump slumped against the frame. He saw a flash of rich, sodden fur and the stiff, desperate movement of a gloved hand trying to find purchase on the frozen wood. It was her. Ilara Vance. A shockwave of adrenaline and cold rage hit Liam. She hadn't just survived the walk to the maintenance yard. She had survived the walk back, and then somehow found the residual strength to crawl the final distance to his cabin. Her sheer, arrogant tenacity was terrifying. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the icy air. He did not open the door. "Ilara!" he called out, his voice calm, pitched to carry through the thick wood but no further. "I know that's you. Speak." A low rattling sound came back, incomprehensible, then a single clear word broken by a cough. "Freeze." Liam leaned his head against the door. He was entirely safe. He could leave her there. Justice would be served, perfectly cold and absolute. She had stolen his means of survival, and now she was paying the ultimate price. He had done nothing but secure his own property, and he had made her fate possible by stripping the emergency supplies. But the cold was a physical thing, and the sound of her cough, wet, deep, and continuous, was the sound of his own conscience, or perhaps just his own humanity. Snapping into focus, he had spent 5 years battling a tyrant, not a monster. Now, the tyrant was a person, dying on his doorstep. He slid the bolt back, opened the door just enough for the figure to fall inward, and then slammed it shut instantly, relocking the heavy-duty bolt. The rush of wind and snow that entered in that second dropped the cabin temperature 10 degrees. Elara didn't so much fall as collapse into a heap of expensive, sodden material. She was rigid, curled into the fetal position, her face visible only as a mask of pale skin rimmed with frost crystals. Her eyes were open, wide, but unfocused, the dark pupils huge and swimming. She was shaking with such violence that her entire body bounced on the floor. "Hypothermia," Liam muttered, his training taking over. She was deep in the mumbles, stumbles, fumbles. She needed core heat, slow rewarming, and dry layers immediately. He dragged her by the heavy fur collar, an easy haul, as she was almost weightless with exhaustion, away from the door and into the center of the main room, where he had a space prepared for triage. He stripped off his outer parka and gloves. "Elara," he said sharply, leaning close to her ear. "Listen to me. You are in my home. I am going to save your life. But you have to listen. Can you hear me?" Her lips parted, a blue slit, and she managed a single rasping word. "Wood!" Liam felt a spike of venomous rage. Even now, half dead, her mind was on the resource she had stolen. He grabbed the heavy leather of her coat and ripped the zipper down, forcing her stiff, icy arms free. "Don't talk about the wood!" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "That wood is why you're here. That wood is my survival which you tried to take. Now you will lie still or you will die where you lie. Do you understand?" Elara's eyes fluttered, registering the cold fury in his face. She managed a single, weak nod. The next 30 minutes were a brutal, tense exercise in physical labor. Liam stripped the heavy, frozen outer layers from her, the parka, the gloves, the boots. Her skin was marbled and icy to the touch. He covered her in every blanket and dry towel he had in the main cabin, avoiding the aggressive heat of the pantry stove for fear of causing shock. He forced a spoonful of high-sugar honey into her mouth, a desperate attempt to fuel the shivering. Once she was wrapped and still, the color slowly, painfully beginning to return to her cheeks. The tremors in her body lessened to a violent, constant shudder. She was still in grave danger, but she was alive, dependent, and conscious enough to realize her situation. Liam sat back on his heels, the axe handle he had kept near the door now resting across his lap. He looked down at the woman who had spent years making his life miserable, who had nearly killed him with her callous control. "You came to the maintenance yard," he stated, not asking. "And you saw the shed was empty, and you saw the wood was frozen." Elara's eyes, now slightly more focused, moved to his face. She couldn't speak, but her expression was one of absolute shattering defeat. The mask of the HOA president had finally cracked. "You stripped my woodpile to teach me a lesson about aesthetics," Liam continued, his voice heavy with the quiet certainty of a judge delivering a life sentence. "The mountain taught you a lesson about survival. Your house is a fridge, your car is dead, your generator is useless, and your emergency supplies which you held captive in the HOA shed are gone. I took the battery charger. A neighbor, seeing the shed open, took the rest of the usable wood." He leaned in close, his shadow covering her face. "You are now 100% reliant on a man you tried to bankrupt and freeze out of his home. I saved your life not because you deserve it, but because I do not allow my enemy to die on my doorstep. It complicates the narrative." He paused, letting the harsh words sink into her consciousness. "You need to get into the warm room, the pantry. But I will not risk my own continued survival or the efficiency of my system for you." Elara finally found her voice, a dry, hoarse whisper. "Liam, The cold, I know the cold. He cut her off, his eyes cold and unforgiving. I live with it every winter. This is what we will do. You will stay in the pantry. You will take up space. You will consume my resources. For this, you will pay a debt. He lowered the axe handle slightly, resting the cold steel on the floor. When the storm breaks and the roads clear, you will sign over the deed to the 4 acres of contiguous, undeveloped forest land adjacent to my property. Bylaw 7.3c will be amended permanently. I will have no more dealings with the HOA. You will resign your presidency and move out of Blackwood Peaks within 6 months. Alara stared at him, unable to process the scale of his demand. He was asking for her career, her financial security, and her life in the community she had created. He was demanding total capitulation. That's illegal, she whispered, shaking her head weakly. It's not illegal when you're signing the paper after you've recovered from near-fatal hypothermia, with a full medical report documenting your condition, Liam countered, his mouth twisting into a humorless smile. Or you can get up, walk back out the door, and rely on the legality of your HOA bylaws to keep you warm. He stood up, walking toward the pantry door and peeling back the blanket. The blast of dry pine-scented heat was almost visible, a golden beacon in the Arctic chill. The thermal envelope is open. This is your chance. You will crawl in, Alara, and you will look at my wood stove. And you will remember exactly what real control looks like. He watched as a flicker of the old rage. The old pride fought with the primal need for warmth in her eyes. It lasted only a second. With a defeated whimper, Alara began to drag her heavy, exhausted body across the freezing floor of the cabin toward the light, toward the sanctuary provided by the man she had sought to destroy. As she cleared the doorway and the blanket dropped back into place, sealing the heat, Liam stood in the freezing outer room, listening to the grateful, desperate sigh Alara gave as she felt the true warmth. The debt had been incurred. But a far more terrifying sound quickly followed, the distinct hollow thump of his propane furnace failing completely. The sound was immediately replaced by the high, thin whine of an emergency pressure alarm beginning to cycle on the dead propane tank. His backup system, his last line of defense, had just died. They were now solely dependent on the small, isolated wood stove and the few logs he had salvaged. His calculated risk had just turned into a shared, critical crisis. The thermal pantry, once a sanctuary, now felt like a pressure cooker of tension and dwindling resources. Liam was hunched over the small stove, feeding it slivers of bark and kindling to keep the oxygen-starved flame alive. Alara lay bundled in the corner, her breathing finally evening out, the harsh rattle replaced by a dry, fragile wheeze. She had passed the worst of the hypothermia, but the fever had set in, a punishing headache and an intense, burning thirst, the hum of the emergency heating element. The nickel-chromium wire had died an hour ago, the deep cycle battery finally depleted. They were now solely dependent on the small stove. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the damp musk of drying clothes. Liam looked at the meager stack of logs remaining, meticulously stacked next to the stove. 3 full logs, 2 half logs. That was it. He had taken enough for 4 days, assuming his furnace would supplement. But his furnace was dead, its pressure alarm now just a weak, mocking chirp in the frozen silence of the outer cabin. They had maybe 8 to 10 hours of viable heat left. The blizzard, which had already lasted 40 hours, showed no sign of relenting. Alara stirred, her eyes tracking the movement of his hands as he placed a pencil-thin piece of wood on the glowing coals. "How long?" she whispered, her voice rough, an unfamiliar sound of fragility. "Not long enough," Liam replied without looking up. "We're out of options. The logs I took were the driest. The rest of the woodpile is frozen solid. It would take more heat than this stove can generate just to thaw them, let alone burn them." She struggled to sit up, leaning her back against the wall, wincing as her muscles protested. She looked at the stove, the tiny heart of their shared existence. The irony was a physical weight in the air. She had confiscated enough wood to heat a small village, and now they were rationing toothpicks. "The generator," she rasped. "My generator. It's only the wires that are fused. If we could get to it. There are tools in the garage." I checked, Liam said, his tone flat. The garage is cold. The tool chest is frozen shut. And the generator cables are custom. You can't bridge that much power with a piece of lamp wire. It's over. Your reliance on convenience failed you. My reliance on backup failed me. We are now reduced to the absolute minimum. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the wind's shriek outside. Ilara finally swallowed her pride entirely, not just the HOA arrogance, but the fundamental pride of her class. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You had every reason. You had the chance." Liam looked at her then, his gaze heavy and uncompromising. "You complicated the narrative," he repeated, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "It wasn't about saving you, Ilara. It was about not letting the mountain take my debt. You owe me the land, the bylaw amendment, and your removal. Dead people don't pay debts. I needed you alive to pay the price of my survival." He paused, then added a truth he hadn't fully articulated before. "And honestly, seeing you crawl across the snow to my door was more satisfying than watching you freeze to death alone." Ilara stared into the fire, her eyes reflecting the orange glow. "I took your wood because I hated the irregularity. I hated that you, the one person who didn't care about my rules, had the absolute certainty of survival. I built the HOA to be impenetrable, to eliminate chaos. I created a community where no one needed wood, where no one had to depend on physical labor. I wanted control." She coughed, a dry, painful sound. "All that control, and I froze in a $5 million house." She reached out a trembling hand and touched the rough bark of the last full log. "You win, Liam. You've already won." "The papers. I'll sign them. I'll give you everything." The admission wasn't a surrender. It was a simple statement of fact. She had paid the price of control, and it was her life. As the afternoon waned, Liam began stripping the outer cabin for fuel. He pulled down the thermal blankets, tearing them into strips. He used the axe to smash a frozen kitchen chair he hadn't used in years. The pantry heat was maintained, but the outer room was now indistinguishable from the outside. He needed to burn the chairwood quickly to sustain the heat while he waited for a sign of the blizzard ending. He needed tinder. Real dry tinder. The paper from his survival packs was too valuable for notes. He looked around the pantry, searching for anything dry that could catch fire quickly. His eyes landed on his backpack resting by the door. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry, was the last piece of HOA property he had taken, the box containing the heavy-duty marine battery charger. He pulled out the box, a clean white carton of thick, dry, pristine cardboard. The perfect tinder. The irony was almost unbearable. This box, which held the very solution to Ilara's first major problem, the dead car battery, was now going to be sacrificed to save both their lives by burning it. "I need this," Liam said. Holding up the box, Ilara didn't object. She simply watched as he used his pocket knife to carefully score the box, tearing off strips of the cardboard. He didn't use the whole thing. He was still conserving. He carefully positioned the dry cardboard strips under the last 2 full logs, using a single match from his waterproof kit. The paper caught instantly, roaring to life, and the dry logs responded, igniting with a beautiful, heat-giving intensity. For a moment, the small room was brilliant with light and warmth. They sat in silence, watching the fire consume the evidence of Ilara's failed escape and Liam's calculated retribution. "There was something else in the shed," Ilara said, her voice softer now, almost conversational. "Under the salt. The HOA bylaws. The originals, printed on thick, archival parchment paper. I kept them there for security." Liam looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "The laws you used to persecute the rest of the community?" "Yes," she admitted. "They're thick paper. It burns slow. It was meant to be the final record of my perfect community." Liam didn't hesitate. "I need the heat." The fire, fed by the high-quality cardboard, was already doing its work. The heat radiating from the little stove was fierce. And then, just as the last of the dry wood was catching, the outside sound changed. The high-pitched scream of the wind died abruptly, replaced by a low, consistent moan. The blinding white light outside the tiny window began to soften, taking on a gray, bruised quality. "It's breaking," Liam said, a wave of exhaustion hitting him now that the tension had eased. The eye is passing, or the storm is moving. They stayed like that for another hour, the temperature stabilizing, the silence around them growing. When the snow finally stopped and the wind calmed to a whisper, the cabin was plunged into a strange, heavy twilight. Liam took a shovel and went outside, the cold air invigorating but manageable. The snow was monumental, but the sky was clearing, showing the faint, bruised pink of a winter sunrise. They had survived. When he came back inside, he found Ilara sitting by the dying stove, staring at the remnants of the fire. She looked old, utterly exhausted, stripped bare of her power and vanity. He walked over to his work desk in the outer cabin, retrieved a stack of pre-printed legal forms and began to fill them out by the week, gray morning light filtering through the frozen windows. The quitclaim deed, the HOA bylaw amendment, and the formal resignation. He returned to the pantry, holding the documents. Ilara didn't flinch. She simply watched him. "You're lucid enough," he stated, placing the papers and a pen on the stack of sleeping bags between them. "The debt is due. You have heat now, you're alive. The price has not changed." Ilara took the pen. Her hand was stiff but steady. She signed the deed transferring the 4 acres of forest land adjacent to his property. She signed the document permanently amending the bylaw to permit exterior wood storage and personal generators. Finally, she signed the resignation. All traces of the HOA president, the woman of rules and control, were gone, traded for survival. She pushed the papers back to him. "It's done," she said. Liam collected the signed documents, a profound, quiet victory unlike anything he had ever imagined. It wasn't just land. It was sovereignty. He opened the outer door of the cabin and pulled out the marine battery charger. "Take this," he said, handing her the cold, heavy box. "You'll need it to get your car started. Drive to the nearest working hotel. Do not come back to Blackwood Peaks." Ilara took the charger, holding the box that had almost been her funeral pyre. She looked at Liam, the man who had defeated her, saved her, and exacted the price of her life. "Liam," she whispered. "The firewood. It's still in the shed, but it's frozen. What are you going to do?" He walked to the wood stove, picked up the axe, and rested the blade on the last glowing coal. He didn't look at her. "I'll chop the frozen logs loose," he said simply. "I'll build a fire." "I'm a survivor, Ilara, not a bureaucrat." She nodded slowly, then pulled her frozen coat back on. She left the pantry and stepped out into the bright, silent, snow-covered world, carrying the very tool that could have saved her pride, now necessary for her escape. Her huge glass mansion stood ruined and frigid in the distance, a massive frozen cage. The only source of warmth in the entire valley belonged to the man she had tried to ruin. The ultimate irony,